Using only primary colors, we're going to be mixing together and creating tints, tones, and shades of the different hues. It's important to know how to mix all of these different colors and values with just the primary so that you're able to mix and color match anything on your reference picture for whatever project that you're working on. The first hue we're going to begin with is blue, so I'm just filling in this first section of the hue with the regular blue, not mixed with anything yet. Now when we're working with a tint, that's adding white into the color, so add a little bit of white. You do need a good amount because the blue goes a long way, so add a good amount of that white and just a little bit of that blue in order to get a tint or a lighter value of your hue. Now I'm going to skip the tone for right now because we need black for both the shade and the tone. So we're going to talk about how to create black using only these primary colors. So starting out, you're going to mix an equal amount of all of the primaries. So the red, blue, and yellow, and then mix that together and you should get a darker value that's pretty close to black. When mixing to create black, it's possible that you could have an extra amount of yellow or too much blue or red. So the best way to double check if you have a pure black or an equal mixture of each of the primary colors is to mix a little bit of white with your black mixture. So here I'm going to just set a little bit off to the side, grab a little bit of white, and if your value that you mix here looks just like a pure gray color, then that's perfect. That means you have an equal amount of all of the primary colors. If not, if the mixture looks a little bit red or like it has a pinkish color or a little bit of blue or yellow, you're going to want to mix the complementary color to whichever hue that is leaning towards. So again, if my value looked a little bit too pink or a little bit too red, I would want to mix green, so blue and yellow, which make green. I would want to mix that into my colors here in order to dull out that red tone and make it a more cohesive black. So the first gray tone that I had mixed looked like a great gray tone, but now I wanted to show you what it looks like if you have too much of a specific color. So I have a little bit too much red here. So when I mix this, you get more of that red toned gray, which means that I need to add those complementary colors. So I added blue and yellow, which make green, because green is the complementary color to red. So then I have more of my pure black, and you can double check it one more time by mixing that white with the black to just make sure that everything is cohesive and a good value. Up next, I'm working on mixing my shade. So a shade is just the black paint mixed with a little bit of blue. So I filled that in. And then the tone is where you're mixing either gray with your hue. So I took blue, added a little bit of black and white to create a gray, and that's just going to desaturate the hue a little bit. Your other option to create a tone is by mixing a complementary color. So I'm using orange to mix with my blue. So orange and blue are complementary colors. So I mixed my orange with red and yellow, and then I mixed that orange hue with the pure blue hue in order to create a tone. So these tones will look slightly different. So you need to decide which of these tones you want to work with, whether you're going to be mixing gray in with your hue every time, or if you want to mix together your complementary color and mix that in with your tone as well. Underneath each hue is a thin strip here for a gradient. So right now we're practicing taking the hue and fading that into the tint. So each of these under every color is going to be different, so you can practice just blending and fading your colors and gradients together. So when you get to final projects and start putting this to practice, you really have a good understanding of how to blend your values and colors. So when you're working on blending from your hue into your tint, just make sure that you have a good amount of overlap where the blue and the white are mixed together in the middle, creating a nice, even, consistent fade and transition from the hue into your tint. The next color we're going to be mixing tints, tones, and shades for is blue-green. Blue-green is a tertiary color, and you create a tertiary color when you're mixing a primary and a secondary together. So right now I'm working on mixing a green color. So I'm using yellow and blue to create a green, equal parts, and I'm mixing and adding more yellow to it until I get to a good hue for a green. And then I'm going to take that green and mix more blue into it so that I have a blue-green hue. So right now I'm just getting a nice green hue wrapped up, and then I'm going to take a little bit of blue and add it to this green so that it again is more blue than it is green. So I'm going ahead and getting that mixed up, and then I'll put that into the first section, which is the hue. So now I'm adding this hue into the rectangle for blue-green, making sure again that it has a little bit more of the blue in that hue. And then I'm going to move on to the tint next. So I'm taking that blue that I already mixed, adding some white into it, and then adding that into the tint value there. And then for the tone, I'm going to be using a little bit of black and just adding that into my tint, because again, if you're using black and white mixed together, that creates gray, and the gray will desaturate how vivid your hue is. So since I already had the white mixed with the blue-green for the hue, I can just add the black into it to create the tone. And then for that shade, I took the hue, so not the tint or tone that I mixed, but the hue, and mixed a little bit of black with it for the shade. Next up is gradient practice. So I'm going to be going from the hue into a shade. So I'm starting with the hue on the left side, which is that blue-green, and then I'm taking black and starting on the right side until they meet towards the middle, and then I'm going to overlap and add a second layer just to get that mixture. So you shouldn't see any specific spot where the color stops and the shade starts. So make sure that you're layering it and really blending that out, especially in the middle where those two meet. On final projects, you will be blending different values together, so it's important to practice this as we go. Next up is green. Green is a secondary color, which means we are mixing two primaries to get to it. So we're mixing an equal amount of blue and yellow in order to create green. So once you have that hue mixed together, add that into the green section and then move on to the tint. So I added a little bit of white, mix that together, filling in the tint here. And then I'm going to move on to the tone next. So I'm mixing a little bit of black into my already mixed tint, since I need the black and the white plus my hue to create the tone. Or if you're using the complementary color, you would want to be mixing a little bit of red to create your tone. And then lastly, I'm working with the shade. So I mixed a little bit of black with my hue and filled in the shade there. And then for the gradient practice, we're going to be going from the hue to tone. So I'm taking my tone on the right and blending that out, and then I'm going to add my hue on the left, and then make sure that they are mixed together where they overlap. Next up is another tertiary color. So this is yellow-green. So I'm going to start out by mixing my green color and then adding extra yellow into it. So that color should be starting out as green with more yellow in order to make it the yellow-green value before we move on to just the plain yellow. So here is about where that hue should look. So again, it starts out as green, has more of the yellow tint to it. And then I'm going to be mixing white with my green in order to create that lighter tint shade. And I'm adding that in. And then I'm going to be moving on to the tone. So a little bit of black mixed in. I might need more of my hue and white just in case that tone appears to be a little bit too gray, a little bit too desaturated. Again, the purpose of a tone is to create more realistic values. In nature, you're going to be seeing more tones versus colors straight out of the bottle. So very important to be practicing how to mix these. And then obviously the shades and the tints are going to be colors that are either shadows or highlights of your tone or your value that you're working with. So lastly here, we're going to be mixing the hue to the tint gradient. So I'm going to start out with my hue for the yellow-green here, and then blend that into my tint, which is just going to be white on the right side, and then overlapping those in the middle so that I can get a nice blend and a nice fade of that gradient. Up next is another primary color, so I'm working with yellow, which is straight out of the container. Typically, like I said, you're not going to be using colors straight out of the tube. So when you're looking at a reference picture trying to color match, remember how we're mixing and creating these tints and tones throughout. Because your color is likely going to be desaturated, which means not a super vibrant vibrant, vivid color. So really look at colors as you're mixing and think about how we're doing this, how we're achieving darker values by mixing black, how we're achieving lighter values by mixing white, and then desaturating or dulling out that color by mixing either gray or the complementary color. So I went in and I added all of those different values, so the tints, the shade, and the tone. And now I'm working with the hue into the shade gradient. So I have the hue of yellow on the left, I added black on the right, and then in the middle I'm overlapping, blending, and fading to get a nice smooth fade from my hue into the darker value. The next color we're mixing is another tertiary color, which is yellow-orange. So start out and mix equal parts of yellow and red in order to get an orange hue. You may have to add a little bit extra yellow in order to get that nice orange value. Since the red is a lot darker, you do need a little bit extra yellow. And then we're gonna add even more yellow to make this a yellow-orange. So I'm adding extra yellow once I feel like I have a good orange hue. Now I'm going to take my yellow-orange hue and add it into the rectangle and then go on to make my tint. So mixing a little bit of white with my yellow-orange, and then I will mix my tone, which is adding a little bit of black and white together with the hue. So I already have that white, just going to add a little bit of black into it, a little bit more of the hue just to make sure I can still see the color and it's not too toned down. And then I'm going to do the shade, which is taking my hue and mixing a little bit of black with it. I do want to mention the reason why we're using the black using primary colors versus the black straight out of the tube is because it does look and feel a lot more natural if we're using a black that is mixed. It's a lot more toned down and not as intense, so it's in the shadow areas of your final project going to feel more natural. But then I took the hue and faded that into the tone, so making sure to blend that out. And now I'm moving on to orange. So I just mixed that orange color. If you still have it, you can continue working with it. But I'm going to remix. So again, equal parts of yellow to red. And then you may have to add more yellow based off of what your color looks like. And then move in and mix your tint, your tone, and your shade with this color. For the gradient, we're going to be blending the hue into the tint gradient for practice with that. So again, that's going to be the hue of orange, fade that towards the middle, take the white, fade that the opposite direction, and blend that out in the middle. Up next is a tertiary color, so it's going to be red-orange. To create red-orange, I'm just mixing orange first, and then adding a bit more red into it so it has that reddish tint to the orange hue. And then I'm mixing white with my tint, toning down the shade with the white and black, or again, the complementary color, and then adding the shade. And for the gradient blend, we're going to be doing the shade into the hue. Next is another primary, so this is red, mixing white for the tint, and then moving on to create the tone and the shade. And then for the gradient blend, we're going to practice mixing the hue with the tone and fading those values together. As you're working, again, remember to practice and think about how we're mixing all of these different values, because next we're going to be moving into some color matching, and it's going to be really important to really understand how to tone down something, how to make it not so vibrant, how to desaturate it, how to lighten or darken the value. The next one that we're going to be doing here is red-violet. So starting out, I would mix your purple value and then bring in a little bit more red. And I also left my purple that I have mixed, or the violet, because that is going to be the next color that we're mixing. So I left that separate so I can come back and use that in the next rectangle. So I have my red here. I'm working on the tint to that red violet, and then moving on to the tone and then the shade. And after that, we're going to be blending the hue into the tint. So the hue into the white on the right and fading those together in the middle. Up next is violet, which again is just mixing your red with blue. And then I'm going through adding my tint, tone, and shade for violet. For the gradient, practice mixing your hue into your shade. So black on the right, fading into the hue on the left. And the last section is blue-violet. So I'm going to take the purple or violet that I already had mixed and then add a little bit more blue into it, create my tone, shade, and tint. And then for the gradient, I'm going to fade the hue into the tone. Again, this is very important to know how to mix all of these different colors together so that when you get to a final painting project, you're able to really look at a color on your reference picture and match it for the hue, the value, and the tone.